we at Downstate suffered our own losses. Among those was Dr. James Mahoney, affectionately known as Charlie to all. We are all very grateful for their service and dedication to Downstate and this community.
Good morning and welcome to Medical Grand Rounds. Today's Grand Rounds is special because we're going to be paying a tribute in honor of Dr. James Mahoney. The Grand Rounds is entitled Celebrating the Clarkson Avenue Legacy of our beloved Dr. James Mahoney. He left us on April 27th, sadly, 2020. The Grand Rounds will be in two parts. Part one is the lecture in his honor, and part two is the celebration of his life. So let's start with part one. We are honoring Dr. Mahoney with a lecture on a topic he loved so much. The topic is the history of maritime medicine. The topic is consistent with Dr. Mahoney's love for the seas. Our speaker is our own Dr. Robert Foronji. Dr. Foronji is Associate Professor and Chief of the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine at Downstate. His career started at Temple for medical school, then to Columbia for residency and fellowship, following which he was retained on faculty to develop his academic career in lung biology. He was recruited to Downstate in 2016 as division chief to build an academic program, which I can comfortably attest that he has done that so well and so beautifully. Dr. Foronji is recipient of numerous awards and grants, including R01 from the NIH, and is so well published. He was instrumental in our critical care COVID-19 pandemic response, ensuring that our institution ramped up as quickly as the pandemic itself in meeting the needs of our patients. Dr. Foronji has deep admiration, affection, and personally cared for Dr. Mahoney, including accompanying him in the ambulance across the river to NYU in the final hours. It is therefore befitting that Dr. Foronji give these grand rounds in Dr. Mahoney's memory. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Foronji to deliver this talk.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to give a grand rounds in honor of Dr. James Mahoney. As many of you are aware, those of us who knew him well, Dr. Mahoney loved to go on cruises, and he had a love of the ocean. So I thought a fitting homage would be to do a grand rounds on the history of maritime medicine. And I think this is something that Dr. Mahoney himself would have really enjoyed. So to begin, I'm going to start with the story of Dr. James Lind, often considered the Hippocrates of naval medicine. He was born in Edinburgh, Scotland on October 4th, 1716. He was not born into a family of doctors. He was the son of a merchant. And in 1731, he was apprenticed to Dr. George Langlands, a local surgeon. And that's how medical training worked back then. It was really an apprenticeship under one individual, and that person had to agree to take you on. As time went on, the process became more formalized into what we know today. But back then it was like a medieval apprenticeship, just like becoming a blacksmith would be. He attended anatomy lectures at Edinburgh University, and then he joined the Royal Navy in 1738 as a surgeon's mate serving under Rear Admiral Nicholas Haddock and later George Edgecombe. He retired from the Navy in 1748, married, and got his MD degree at Edinburgh University, studying the thesis of venereal diseases, which was a very important topic for the Navy and the sailors. He was appointed to the Royal College of Surgeons, a great honor, in 1750, and served as the group's treasurer. He resigned to take the chief physician position at the Royal Hospital at Haslart, which was established in 1758. And he served until his retirement in 1783. Interestingly, his son was the one who succeeded him upon retirement. So although he didn't come from a family of physicians, his his sons went into the profession. And he died in 1794. Now, this is the surviving portrait of James Lind. Actually, it had been lost. No one knew where it was until a private family stepped forward from South Africa, and it was discovered again about 50 years ago. This is Sir George Chalmers' portrait of James Lind, dating from 1783. And he has on the table, which he's posing with, 4 of his greatest works. And the reason why we're recognizing him in this talk about maritime medicine. Perhaps his greatest contribution was his book on Lind on Scurvy from 1753. And then also there's Lind on Climate. Another book is An Essay on the Most Effectual Means of Preserving the Health of Seamen. And then a book, 2 papers on fevers and infection, which was published in 1763. This is, to the right, is a portrait of the HMS Salisbury. And this was the ship that Dr. Lind was serving on when he made his important discoveries that led to the publication of his book on scurvy. Now, lest you think this is a disease that's relegated to earlier times, unfortunately, it is a disease that is still present in the modern era. There was a scurvy outbreak among South Sudanese adolescents and young men, and this is a Morbidity Mortality Weekly Report on the symptomatology. This is from January 28th, 2019. And look at the symptoms. Almost 60% had lower limb swelling, ankle swelling, lower limb pain, knee swelling, ankle pain. What we're all familiar with from the medical textbooks and from our teaching in medical school is gum bleeding and swelling. But there's also knee pain, chest pain, bleeding, slow wound healing, and you can even develop cardiopulmonary insufficiency as a consequence of advanced scurvy. And it is untreated, it is a fatal disease. Here are the physical signs of scurvy. This is, to the top left is the one that we're probably most familiar with. Gingival bleeding and hemorrhage. The gum findings, I think, are what they teach us in med school. But remember what scurvy is. Scurvy is a disease of deficiency of vitamin C. Vitamin C, our bodies don't store it, and our bodies can't make it. We lack the enzyme to produce vitamin C. So we depend on our diet. And most of vitamin C is obtained from fruit and vegetables. And when these sailors were going off on these long voyages, these are things that aren't so easy to keep, particularly in the moist environment of a ship. And some of these things, like oranges, were in short supply, to be frank. So providing these for the sailors was sometimes difficult. What does vitamin C do? Well, it's a cofactor for lysyl oxidase, and that creates covalent crosslinks on the N-terminal of collagen. Collagen exists as fibrils, and those fibrils are physically attached to each other through these crosslinks at the N-terminus, giving collagen its strength. So it's important in bones, it's important in tendons, ligaments, the extracellular matrix for your heart, for your lungs, blood vessels, and that explains some of the manifestations. So here's a young adolescent, and you can see their metaphyseal plate is eccentric, it's thickened, it's sclerotic, and this is due to a deficiency of vitamin C. If left untreated, they'll get frog leg deformities. So it's very important for proper bone maturation. Here's a classic sign of scurvy, the parafollicular hemorrhage. Blood vessels have in their wall collagen, particularly type 3 collagen. And again, for the strength of collagen, you need these crosslinks. So without vitamin C, collagen becomes weak, the blood vessel becomes fragile, and you develop hemorrhages. And also hair is collagen. And look at this hair. Characteristic corkscrew hairs is another manifestation. So these are the physical signs, and James Lind would have been very familiar with these physical manifestations. So let's talk about his treatise on scurvy. This was a major health problem in the 1700s in the Royal Navy. It was estimated, and this might be a bit of an exaggeration, that 1 million sailors died from this affliction. And even if it's not a million, it was a significant number. Published in 1753, this book, the Treatise on Scurvy, is remarkable for a couple of things. One is his extensive review of the literature, documenting the literature to affirm his personal observations. This wasn't commonplace at that time. And the other thing this book is remarkable for, it's one of the first randomized clinical trials. So scurvy was very common at that time. So in May of 1747, while he was serving on the Salisbury, patrolling off the Bay of Biscay, an outbreak occurred, and a tenth of the crew was afflicted. So he decided to conduct, quote unquote, a fair test, what we would call a randomized clinical trial, on 12 sailors with scurvy. And look how he described it, who were as similar as I could have them. So all these individuals had the same living conditions, same diet. So already it was an appreciation of addressing selection bias. And what he did is he allocated these sailors to each of 6 daily treatments. So they'd be in groups of 2 being allocated to these treatments. And these treatments can continue for 6 days, and I'll explain why only 6 days. One would get 1.1 liters of cider. One group would get 25 mils of elixir vitriol, which is a dilute sulfuric acid. One would get 18 mils of vinegar 3 times a day. One would get half a pint of seawater. Wouldn't have wanted to be randomized into that group. And one was given 2 lemons and 1 orange, continued for 6 days only. The reason it was only 6 days is these lemons and oranges were in short supply. He ran out. And it shows you part of the problem why scurvy was so common amongst the sailors. There was a scarcity of these fruits. The 6th group got a medicinal paste made up of mustard seed, garlic, radish root, and gum myrrh. And what did he find? Here were his results. The most sudden and visible good effects were perceived from the use of oranges and lemons. One of those who had taken them being at the end of 6 days now fit for duty. The other was best recovered of any in his condition, and being deemed now pretty well, was appointed nurse to the rest of the sick. So it was a remarkable finding. Within 6 days, he saw a substantial improvement in only those 2 who were randomized to the lemons and oranges. Now, unfortunately, Lind didn't really bolster his own findings, and he was kind of equivocal in some of his own writings about what he had found. That and a stubborn admiralty, and Lind's work was unable to persuade the admiralty on the virtues of citrus fruits. In fact, it was not until 1795, almost 50 years later, when the physician Gilbert Blaine championed Lind's work, that the leaders were finally prompted to act. And citrus fruits became part of the staple of a sailor's diet. Now, this had a big impact on the seamen in the Royal Navy. Between 1795 and 1806, the Navy's sick list was halved. And this contributed to victory in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. For those of you that are students of history, you would know this is when Sir Admiral Lord Nelson defeated the French Navy and established the supremacy of the British Navy at sea. And much of the victory can be attributed to the adaptation of citrus fruits in the diets of the sailors, because they weren't losing as many sailors because of it. Lind, in his lifetime, tried to create like an inspissated juice, but it contained virtually no vitamin C, so it had little impact. And it wasn't until Frederick Gowland Hopkins' paper on accessory food factors in 1912 that we knew why vitamin C was important, but they did know that it had something to do with the fruits. In fact, people had known this for quite a while. Vasco da Gama, in his voyages around the world, sent sailors to retrieve oranges for the sick way back in 1498. Sir Richard Hawkins used oranges and lemons to treat scurvy as he sailed near Brazil almost 100 years later. And look what his quote says. "This is a wonderful secret of the power and wisdom of God that hath hidden so great an unknown virtue in this fruit to be a remedy for this infirmity." So it's amazing how medical discoveries don't get propagated at this time, whereas now they would be propagated almost overnight thanks to the internet and other media that we have. John Woodall, who was the first Surgeon General of the East India Company, reported on the anti-scurvy properties of lemons in his book, The Surgeon's Mate, and this dates from 1617. He commented, "Make sure there's a good quantity of juice of lemons sent in each ship." So it's amazing it took hundreds of years for these observations to finally change clinical practice. But the reason change occurred was because of Lynn's work. It was delayed, but Gilbert Blaine used his data, his trial, to convince the Admiralty to finally make change. So this and Lynn's development of a systematic review of the literature were major contributions not only to maritime medicine, but to medicine in general. And Lynn also developed a system to distill fresh water for sailors. So we'll talk more about that later. Now let's delve into the 19th century maritime medicine. And much of this focuses on the British Navy or the Royal Navy because they were the dominant naval force at the time. And you'll notice I put as the header here, cleanse or die. So it was recognized that the cramped, crowded, and unsanitary conditions of naval vessels created the perfect environment for contagion. They didn't know why. They didn't know it was a bacteria or a virus. They just knew that it was associated with this, just from observation. So the demand for maritime labor led to reforms in every area of naval hygiene: sanitation, ventilation, dietary and drink allowances, clothing, bedding, exercise, rest. The Navy needed these sailors, and they couldn't afford to lose them at the rate they were losing them in the 18th century. So they really had to adopt reforms. And these reforms worked and dramatically started to decrease mortality. And it's interesting because maritime medicine became a wonderful lab to test these interventions because you have a very hierarchical structure. It's much harder on land to implement some of these changes as opposed to the strict hierarchical structure of a Navy vessel. So again, the emphasis was placed on dryness, cleanliness, and proper ventilation. And naval surgeons were required to keep exhaustive logs about illnesses encountered, and authorities used these to create annual health reports, sort of like the morbidity, mortality weekly report that I referenced earlier. And this started to better disseminate information. Remember, Lynn's discovery languished for 50 years before it led to change. Now I'm going to talk about a major event that occurred in the 1800s that had a big impact on maritime medicine, and it's centered on the HMS Eclair. Now, Great Britain abolished slavery in 1807, but as we know, the institution continued, the transatlantic slavery institution continued until 1865 with the end of the Civil War, but slavery continues to this day. There's sex trafficking in the United States. There's widespread slavery. It's been estimated 600 to 700,000 live enslaved in Africa today and other parts of the world. So unfortunately, it's an institution that's been with us from the beginning of time. Now, in 1845, in February of that year, the HMS Eclair was sent out on really a humanitarian mission, an anti-slavery mission to cut down on the slave trade off the coast of Africa. Now, there was an outbreak of yellow fever on board, and by July, they started to make their way back to England. And they headed to the Cape Verde Islands, which are off the northwest coast of Africa. Now, when they were heading to the Cape Verde Islands, the sailors themselves kind of downplayed the outbreak that was occurring on the ship, and they were allowed to disembark there. And as a result, a third of the inhabitants of the Cape Verde Islands died after the Eclair stationed there. Now, if the crew had just stayed put there, they probably would have been better off, because the Eclair was a steamer, and the ship's boilers created a warm, moist environment for mosquitoes, which facilitated the transmission during the voyage. So you got this, under the underside of the boiler, this warm, moist environment. Mosquitoes are breeding there like crazy. The sailors are packed in tight quarters into this ship 24/7. It's a perfect breeding ground for the spread of yellow fever and other diseases. A month later, 39 had died during their voyage back, including the assistant surgeon. They were denied entry into Madeira, Portugal, and the ship's captain and remaining medical staff perished. And then 17 more died as they made their way from Portugal to England. And then when they arrived in England, they were placed into quarantine, and another 5 died. So 60 officers and crew, a whopping 50% of the total, died in only a few months. And the handling of this case was hotly debated in the Navy and the medical community, including the use of quarantine. And we see that today. People debate the pros and cons of quarantine. But it led to a serious appraisal of why did this happen and what could we do to prevent similar things from happening in the future. Now, at the time, the Admiralty and most people subscribed to the miasmic theory of disease. There was something in the water. There was something in the air. There was something in the soil that contributed to the disease, and it was just bad humors, so to speak, that caused disease. The contagion nature of disease was not truly appreciated. And Alexander Bryson became the director of the Naval Medical Department from 1864 to 1869. And he wrote a book on the Report on Climate and Diseases of the African Station in 1847 and outlined the risk associated with tropical diseases and talked about the Eclair case. And in the case of the Eclair, he pointed out that simple measures would have dramatically reduced the mortality from this outbreak, including limiting the landings of ships. So there were stations in these tropical regions. And he pointed out the more ships disembark at these stations, the more exchange you have, the greater the opportunity to spread contagion. So he recognized this in the 1800s. The other thing he recognized is sending ships to cooler climates would have a positive impact. And that makes sense because you need the warm environment in order for the mosquitoes to breed. He didn't know why sending someone to a cooler environment would be better. He just knew it was. It took, I think it was in the late 1890s that they realized that the mosquito was the vector for many of these diseases like yellow fever and malaria. Now, he implemented some of these changes to limit the number of vessels that came to these stations. So to give you an idea of the impact of his interventions, in 1829, 202 of the 792 men that were stationed on these, they're kind of like naval bases in Africa, died. And that number plummeted to 10 out of 992 in 1854. And this is several years after publication of his book. So talk about having a huge public health impact. Just simple measures dramatically reduce the mortality associated with that. But yet, again, there was still considerable debate about the case of the Eclair. And, they had a lot of sympathy from the public, these poor sailors. Here they were doing a humanitarian issue to protect people from being forced into slavery. And they died carrying out this mission. And not only that, they were denied entry when they made it home. And more died. Uh, Now, talking further about 19th century naval medicine, let's talk about some of the impact of these interventions. So, as I mentioned, the elimination of scurvy had a huge impact on the Royal Navy and actually led to their success in major battles. And between the 1780s and the 1820s, just simple things like anti-scurvy measures, soap, cleanliness, decreased the incapacitation of sailors by 60%. And that's great from a humanitarian perspective, but from a military perspective, that's huge and gives you a huge competitive advantage against your enemy. Gilbert Blaine estimated that 1 in 3.3 naval men were invalidated in 1782. And by 1829, that had been reduced to 1 in 8.9. Again, a huge reduction. William Burnett took charge of the Navy's medical service in 1838. One of his major contributions was the implementation of statistical analysis. These were things that didn't really exist before. We do this all the time now. Retrospective analysis, we'll do prospective analysis. Back then, this kind of systematic analysis and statistical analysis didn't exist. And that led to better understanding of measures that would be effective, and some of them we've already talked about. Now, in the 19th century, there were major changes that led to seismic shifts in the Navy and in maritime medicine. Wood made it difficult to maintain a clean and dry environment. And if you've ever seen wood that's been moist for too long, it just kind of gets grungy. Now, the shift from sail to steam and wood to steel led to major changes. Ships became bigger, and maintaining proper ventilation below deck became even more important. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little later on. Another major thing that happened, boy, it always seems like history repeats itself. So if you want to know the future, really study the past. And here's a perfect example, the Crimean War, 1853 and 1856. And I bring this up because this was a naval battle as well as a land battle, and it led to major changes in medicine. So many of you have probably heard about this. This is the Crimea, which is clearly part of Ukraine. Recently, Vladimir Putin annexed this. He's actually building a huge bridge to connect it with mainland Russia. But it's physically, it is part of the Ukraine. Why is Crimea so important? It's this little thing here, Sevastopol. This is a warm weather port. So, as many of you were, one of the major naval bases in Russia is St. Petersburg. The problem with that is it freezes over in the winter. So the Russians wanted to have a warm weather port. And what they wanted to do was to seize this area and the Strait of Dardanelles from the Turks. And that way their navy would have access to the Mediterranean. This was an existential threat to the British and to the French. So they teamed with the Turks to fight the Russians and prevent them from taking over this area. Now, what's striking about this war is that disease killed 4 times as many people as battle wound injuries. And we'll talk a little bit about that, why. 25,000 British, 100,000 French, and up to 1 million Russians died from disease. So this was a staggering casualty list from the poor hygiene and unsanitary conditions that existed during this war. And here's a quote from Fanny Duberly. She was the wife of a British officer. And look at her quote. Now, Balaclava is right by Sevastopol, and that's where a major battle occurred because the British, French, and Turks were trying to overpower Sevastopol and force the Russians into submission. So look at this quote. Take a village of ruined houses in the extremest state of imaginable dirt. Allow the rain to pour into them until the whole place is a swamp of filth. Catch about 1,000 sick Turks with the plague and cram them into these houses indiscriminately. and stew them all up together in a narrow harbor, and you will have a tolerable imitation of the real essence of balaclava. So you can see this is a perfect breeding ground for disease. And really, this is one of the reasons on both sides so many succumb to illness. But it was recognized early on what was happening. And this led to major medical innovations that changed the way we practice medicine today. That's why it's important to be aware of this. So Florence Nightingale arrived into this squalor and instituted sweeping reforms. Look at some of the life-saving measures that she instituted. Hand washing, washing the soldiers, giving them clean beds. In the early 1800s, patients used to share a bed. Can you imagine? The nosocomial infections because of that. They removed soiled clothes from wounded soldiers. Wounds were actually washed. They used clean linens. One of the first things she did when she arrived at Scutari Hospital was to order all these Turkish linens, and this helped to prevent cross-infection. She also kept the windows open in the hospital to allow better ventilation, and they rapidly had developed a system to rapidly eliminate excrement and waste. And this had dramatic effects on mortality in the war. And many of these measures are with us today. Now again, this is the 1850s. They didn't understand why a lot of these worked, but they did them anyway because they knew they did work. Germ theory came by a little bit later on with Pasteur and others. One of the major contributions, and I think it's fitting to talk about this since Dr. Mahoney was such a great intensivist, is that Florence Nightingale, a nurse, was really the one who gave birth to the ICU and started the ICU. This is a picture of her on the left. One of the affectionate nicknames for her by the sailors and other soldiers was the lady with the lamp, because she would make her nighttime rounds to tend to the wounded and sick and save many lives with her team of nurses. So she encountered chaos at Scutari Hospital. Scutari Hospital is very close to Istanbul. The dying were mixed in with the lightly wounded, a completely nonsensical way to do that, but that's how it was done at the time. This was a waste of resources, and it led to high mortality rates. She introduced the concept of triage. She sent the sickest patients to designated areas, and those areas were given more resources and more staff. So in essence, this is the creation of the modern ICU, right? That's all an ICU is. It's an area where you have a higher nursing levels to better attend to patients. In fact, the nurses are the ones that really save the lives in the ICU. Her efforts decreased mortality from 40% to 2%. And later in her life, she was awarded one of the most prestigious honors a British subject can receive, which is the Order of Merit. So this war led to monumental changes in medicine that exist with us to today. Now let's get back to talking about ventilation issues. You're on a ship. Seems like there's plenty of air on deck. What's the problem? Well, what about below deck, right? Especially as ships are getting bigger. Now they're steam powered. They're steel now. You can make them even bigger. How do you maintain proper ventilation? So clean air had to be drawn in and bad air had to be exhausted out. And to give you an idea of the impact of this, in 1846, 13 patients were suffocated on the transport vessel Maria Sams. In 1848, just 2 years later, 73 immigrants died aboard the Londonderry when during a storm the captain had to batten down the hatches and the ventilation became so poor that they literally suffocated. So it quickly became obvious that major innovations had to be adapted to improve ventilation. One solution is, just make the areas and the rooms bigger below deck. But this is expensive and not very practical. A more practical approach is to supply a constant flow of air and calculate the hourly requirement of air. Now, the ideal air exchange at the time was debated. Maybe, even today I think there's some debate. But the CDC recommends at least 6 room exchanges per hour. In fact, it's mandated for any medical facilities. Now, one good thing is that steam power facilitated this because it could power fans that could drive ventilation systems. And that could help to exchange the air in these compartments. Some of them may be below the waterline, right? So how are they going to get ventilation? So it's interesting. Medical officers on these ships had to be engineers. And they had to really not only know ship design, but to participate in ship design. And they also had to know how to step in a moment's notice to manipulate these ventilation systems as needed. So medical officers not only had to be medical officers, they actually had to be engineers as well because of some of these issues. What about hydration issues? Water was often a source of outbreak on ships. The wooden cask contaminated the water and it had to be boiled. The English shifted to iron cask in the 19th century. Unfortunately, the French shifted to lead cask, and you could imagine how well that went. Also, particularly in tropical climates, stopping for water was hazardous, and it led to opportunities to contract local diseases and also waterborne diseases. Maybe the water you're taking on board the ship is contaminated. So by the 1870s, the Royal Navy started to issue chemical tests to test the quality of water, and that seemed to help and deal with some of these diarrheal illnesses that were afflicting the sailors at very high rates. But another major innovation was steam. So steam vessels provided potential for a fresh and unlimited supply of water through the distillation of seawater. And this is from the late 1800s. I believe this is a French company, Chaplin's Patent Distilling Apparatus. And what it does is it used seawater and it used the steam from the ship's boilers to heat the water, and then the water would go through these metal coils. And then you would have cool water on the outside of those metal coils. And that would, and it was constantly flowing, always maintaining. So the hot steam inside the metal coil meeting the cool water on the outside of the coil, and that would lead to condensation on the surface of the coil, and that condensation could be collected, and that was potable drinking water, very good quality too. So this machine could generate approximately 23 US gallons per hour, just one of these machines. So this negated the need to stop in ports and pick up water, and really had a big impact on hydration issues and diarrheal illnesses. Now let's get back to dampness and cleanliness issues. So the French hygienist Jean-Baptiste Fonsegrives once said, "A damp ship is an unhealthy ship." So moisture condenses on steel surfaces, leading to humid environments. So that's a problem. We've already talked about the boilers and how that could create a breeding ground for mosquitoes. Also, this humidity that builds up. As a pulmonologist, I can tell you it's a big problem encountered by my COPD and asthma patients. The humidity can promote asthma and facilitates the growth of mold and other germs that provoke it. And so respiratory illnesses were a frequent ailment affecting the sailors. Now, water tends to accumulate in the bilge of ships, and what the bilge is that part of the ship that if it were resting on the ground would be touching the ground, so the very bottom of the ship. And down there in that water that is collecting there, you get mixture with coal, and that would produce dangerous gases like hydrogen sulfide, toxic. So extreme efforts were made to eliminate these pools of water. Ships use chlorine or Condy's fluid, potassium permanganate, to disinfect surfaces and pools of water. And the other thing that steam did is allowed to use superheated steam to clean surfaces on the ship. So these were leading to innovations that were leading to more sanitary environment. They recognized dampness was the enemy of the sailor. So extreme efforts were made to try to keep a dry environment, which, as you can imagine, in a ship is not so easy. Now let's talk a little bit about 20th century Royal Naval Medicine. So the Royal Naval Medical College in Greenwich was founded in 1912, and it made major contributions shortly after its founding. In World War I, it produced vaccines against typhoid, cholera, influenza, gas gangrene. It developed the first tab vaccine against typhoid in 1916. The director of pathology at the Royal Navy College was a major figure in leading to mass immunization efforts against diphtheria in Great Britain in the 1930s. So this Royal Naval College made major contributions to medicine. Now, in the 1800s, or the latter half of the 19th century, TB was a huge problem for seamen. 8 per 1,000 years, with a 25% mortality rate. Between 1921 and 1934, this decreased to 2 per 1,000 per annum. That was still double the rate for the Army and Air Force. And you can imagine why. You have sailors that are cramped into very tight spaces for really long periods of time. So this becomes a perfect breeding ground for tuberculosis. Now, U.S. naval medical history is not as illustrious as Royal or British naval medical history, because the U.S. Navy is, its history is not as long. In fact, it's kind of humorous. After the Revolutionary War, all the U.S. naval vessels, every single one of them was sold, which is, you think about that as a country. I mean, you might want to have a navy. And the country had thriving trade with China, India, and the Mediterranean. So without a navy, our merchant vessels were confiscated, and the crews were enslaved off the coast of the Barbary Coast, off the coast of North Africa. In fact, it's ironic that at a time when massive slavery was occurring with African slaves coming to the Americas, there was about 1 million people at the same time, Europeans, that were being enslaved off the coast of North Africa. So this was a big problem for a young nation. And there was a real public indignation about our sailors being captured in this way, and it had a huge economic impact that I'll talk about as well. So in 1794, the young Congress decided to commission 6 frigates to offer protection for our trade in the Mediterranean. And it was stipulated at this time there should be 1 surgeon and 2 surgeon mates for every 44 guns on a ship, and 1 surgeon and 1 mate for every 32 guns. Pay was $50 a month for a surgeon and $30 a month for the mates. Now, naval trade in 1798 generated for the U.S. $125 million in economic activity. Building and maintaining the Navy cost $2.5 million, but the savings in maritime and marine insurance alone was $8.5 million. So it was very cost effective to build a Navy, and it was probably really foolish to just immediately after the Revolutionary War just to scrap it. So the Congress adopted the Naval Department in 1798, and George Balfour was the first surgeon on the USS Constellation. Now, the young country was still wavering about having a Navy, and so they decided, well, let's just pay Algiers $1.5 million for ransom and safe passage for our vessels and for our sailors. But then other cities and states wanted similar tribute. In fact, Tripoli declared war on the U.S. in 1801. The surgeon John Cowdery on the USS Philadelphia was held for 19 months. And he actually ended up, besides caring for U.S. Navy sailors, the quality of his care led him to catch the attention of the local Bashaw, and then Dr. Cowdery ended up caring for several family members. And the Bashaw really wanted Dr. Cowdery to stay. He developed such affection for him that he really wanted him to stay at the end of the war. So let's talk a little bit now about the history of U.S. naval medical vessels. Now, the reality, even to this day, most naval hospitals were converted from troop transports, passenger liners, or tankers. Only the USS Relief in 1919 was actually designed to be a hospital. Now, the USS Intrepid was the first naval hospital in our history. What it's famous for is before it became a naval hospital, it was used when the USS Philadelphia ran aground off the coast of Tripoli. That's when the crew, including John Cowdery, were taken prisoner. And the United States Navy didn't want the Philadelphia to fall in the hands of the Tripoli. So at night, a smaller vessel, the Intrepid, was sent to set it ablaze, and that's what they did. So the Philadelphia was lost, and it didn't fall into the hands of the enemy. And then later, the Intrepid was converted into a naval hospital. Now, many these medical vessels served as ambulances. The USS Red River in the Civil War ferried injured sailors up the Mississippi to Mound Island. The USS Solace in World War II ferried injured sailors from Iwo Jima to Guam. Some naval vessels served as kind of station hospitals. For example, the USS Haven in Korea in 1951, and the USS Haven also served in Long Beach in California from 1953 to 1957. Interestingly, an earlier version of the U.S. naval ship Comfort and Mercy were actually stationed in New York during the 1918 pandemic. So it's ironic that the Comfort came back during this pandemic because about 100 years earlier it had been in New York for the influenza pandemic. So it's, like I said earlier, it's amazing how often history repeats itself. Here are the USNS Mercy and Comfort. They're, as you could recall from the video, they're actually quite large vessels. They have 1,000 beds with 12 fully functional ORs, radiographic facilities, laboratory facilities, pharmacy, and even a medical repair shop. So they can pretty much do everything a hospital can do. These were not built, even our modern naval vessels weren't built to be hospitals. They were built in the 70s to be oil tankers and then were converted into hospitals. The USNS Mercy was stationed in Oakland after the 1989 earthquake, tending to the ill. And the UNS Comfort was stationed in New Orleans after Katrina in 2005, and again providing service to those working in lower Manhattan after 9/11. Now, to compare these ships with some of the bigger hospitals in our region, Columbia has 738 beds, Mount Sinai has 1134, NYU Tisch has 725. So in terms of beds, it's comparable to the biggest hospitals. Where the big difference is, these other hospitals have like 60, 80 ORs, and they have 12 ORs. Now, what about modern maritime medicine? What are the modern challenges for seafarers? And you'll be kind of surprised to learn that non-natural deaths account for 40 to 50% of all maritime deaths. I guess there's a chat on one of the cable stations, the Deadliest Catch, I think was the name of the show. And it was fishermen off the coast of Alaska and how many, you could see how dangerous that job was. A Danish study found accidents were 11.5 times more common in seafarers. Piracy is also a big issue. In 2008, 774 crew members were kidnapped, and about 30, 40, 50 of these remain unaccounted for to this day. Here's something to think about. Cardiovascular disease. It's a leading killer. 27 to 45 deaths per 100,000 seafarer years. And there was a Polish study in 2003 that showed a quarter of those suffering an MI while at sea were alive after 1 year. So there's going to be a delay. You're in the middle of the ocean. There's going to be a delay. And it's not like these vessels have sophisticated advanced medical facilities for you. They have a medical officer. And that medical officer is not a health professional. That medical officer is a crew member that has some degree of medical training, can probably do CPR, basic things like that, could communicate. Maybe they'd be better communicating with medical personnel on the radio, but they're not a PA, they're not a nurse practitioner, they're not a doctor. So delaying care for cardiovascular disease can have tragic outcomes for these individuals. Also, especially after 9/11, ports restrict access for sailors. So this leads to tremendous problems of social isolation. Sailors are 3 times more likely to commit suicide. And lastly, let's think about what these vessels are carrying. A lot of them are oil tankers, so there's tremendous benzene exposure, which is a cancer-causing agent, UV light, which is a cancer-causing agent, and alcohol and tobacco use are greater in the sailors. So on average, the cancer risk for a sailor is 2 to 3 times greater than it is for people living on land. So these are the major challenges that exist today and things that need to be addressed to further improve maritime medicine. Now, I'll just end on this slide, and it makes me think of Dr. Mahoney and his love for the ocean, his love for cruising. And if you see in there, you see the sun, which is a source of light and energy, and certainly Dr. Mahoney was such a bright light in all of our lives, and someone that you meet for one day and you remember for the rest of your life. That's how charismatic and how passionate he was as a person. You see clouds, so I think of spirit, wind, and you see the ocean, and the ocean itself is a symbol of life, water. So when I see this, it gives me a feeling of peace, and I know that Dr. Mahoney, who lived his whole life in service of others and laid down his life for his fellow man, is at peace. So God bless him.
Thank you, Dr. Foronji, for such a wonderful talk. We will now move to part 2 of the program. Dr. Mahoney was one of the great physicians we ever had. He practiced all 3 of his subspecialties: primary care, internal medicine, pulmonary medicine, and critical care medicine, all at the same time in the 26 years that I have known him. I have personally worked with and shared patients with him, and I can tell that he's one of the best that we ever had. As a department, we went through the pandemic together, and we wanted to celebrate him with all of us together before the graduating residents and fellows leave campus. In this part, we will start with a prayer and reading from our own Reverend Sharon Cardinal Walker. Following that, we will have a series of short presentations by friends and colleagues who knew him so well, including Dr. Robert Foronji, who will show us some of his fun pictures, followed by Dr. Michael Lucchese, Chair of Emergency Medicine, Simon McFarland, Director of the Internal Medicine Program, B.B. Cartoon, a very close colleague in primary care, Joseph Garga, a former fellow and now attending at Kings County Hospital, Janice Thomas, representing the critical care nurses, Vitas Veku, representing the critical care fellows, a poem reading, and finally, we would have the family make some comments.
Greetings to you all on this sacred day. I would like to ask that you would join me in a moment of silence. Join with me in honoring our beloved brother, the one we knew as clinician, distinguished clinician, exceptional teacher and human being, a caring mentor, a friend, and a selfless provider. In fact, he was the people's physician, Dr. James Mahoney. There are 2 scriptures that meant the world to Dr. Mahoney. We had opportunities in an illness that he had, and I was gracious enough to be graced by his presence and to be at his bedside. And those scriptures begin with the 91st division of Psalm, followed by John 14:1-4. The 91st division of Psalm reads as follows: He that dwelleth in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in Him will I trust. Surely He shall deliver me from the snare of the fowler and from the noisome pestilence. He shall cover me with His feathers, and under His wings shall I trust. His truth shall be my shield and my buckler. James believed that. And John 14:1-4 is what I believe that he wants us all to hold on to. And it reads, "Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again, James, and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also." Let us pray. Source of all that we are, Almighty and eternal God, God of life, eternal King, gracious God, we come before you this morning, O God, asking that you would be with us. Allow the very spirit and the essence of your presence to rest, rule, and abide with us. God, we're here today because our brother, your son and our beloved, has departed this life unto sunset. We believe, O God, many of us, that this departure was much too soon. But we're thankful today that we're able to relish in thoughts concerning the memories of his life, the service, and, O God, his legacy. We ask now that you would be with each of us. We ask that your divine presence would seek to comfort us as we reflect and remember your servant leader, the incredible physician in Dr. James. Lord God, he has run a race well. And so that we ask now that you would just continue to grant the peace to his family. Grant those of us who remain yet to do work, the pleasures of remembering, O God, but to do that which has been set to our hands. Move around this gathering, O God. Move around those that are sitting and seated and watching, O God. And allow each of us to be as bold and as forward and advanced and filled with tenacity the same way that your manservant had been filled. Let us not be afraid or ashamed to do what we have been called to. Oh God, let us move the way he has moved so that we can make the impact that he has impacted. Bless us now and keep us. Allow your presence to rule. Be with his family and cause them to know that James will continue to be with them, that he has been indeed promoted from this life to a celestial city where there is no more pain, a celestial city where he has been promoted to walk the streets of gold, where he has been promoted to just continue to be who he is, an extreme light and a comforter. We thank you, and we all say amen.
So now it's time to say a few words about our colleague, our friend, mentor, Dr. James Mahoney, or as we knew him, Charlie. And it's really hard to put in words how much he meant to everyone individually and to Downstate as an institution. Charlie was the heart, the soul, and really the lifeblood of this institution. He was a tireless worker, really committed to service. I think he really embodied the principles of Downstate. We're a medical service center that serves a deserving urban community. And he was passionate about that. And he was a great mentor to so many. And there's so many great physicians who are better today for having been under his wing. And one of the things that Dr. Mahoney did is he didn't burden anyone with low expectations. He demanded the best out of everyone. And why wouldn't he? He gave his best. He always gave 110%. He never shortchanged a patient. I never saw it. In fact, I'm inheriting some of his patients in clinic now, and you could see the quality of care that he provided to this community. And this man did this working day, night, always in service of others. And when he was training the fellows, they loved him. But he didn't treat them with kid gloves. He gave them real love. he let them know that there was a standard that he was expecting them to live up to. And the value of what he imparted to them can't be replaced. There will really not be another Dr. Mahoney. And his loss is really felt tremendously by the whole institution, but particularly us in pulmonary and critical care. You know, we're a small group. There were, before this pandemic, there were only 6 pulmonary and critical care physicians. And like I said, you know, Charlie was, you know, one of the sources of our greatest joy. His clinic office was about 2 doors down from me. It wasn't often that I'd have a pause and nobody waiting to see me. But whenever I did, I would always just kind of meander over there and see if he was free. And, you know, 20 minutes could melt away in what seemed like 30 seconds. We could talk about anything. And for me, it was it's a great personal loss because for what all he did for the community. And he was also, in many ways, someone that I could lean on as the chief of the division. I could bounce ideas off him. And I come from this neighborhood, and he's been here since 1982. So our time in Brooklyn overlapped. And he was someone that I could talk about Lum's Chinese restaurant on Avenue D, or the movie theater that used to exist in. He would know about it, and we had a lot of that to share. And losing him took the joy out of the division, and it's going to take a long time for that to come back. I know that what he would have wanted. He was a soldier in service of others, and he would want us to continue to fight for the people of Brooklyn. And so even though, you know, we all have heavy hearts, there've been many a day I walk here and I'm crying, you know, thinking about losing Dr. Mahoney and not being able to just have a conversation with him, and thinking about what he meant to so many people, how he treated everyone with dignity and respect. And I also think about how great the world would be if everyone were like that. You know, sadly, we see a lot of negativity. I'm glad that he got some notoriety and some recognition for what he did. And he's truly someone that I and everyone here really loved. And losing him is incredibly painful. But like I said, we will continue to move on, to move forward, I should say, and continue the work that he did for so many years. And God bless Dr. Mahoney, and what he did will stay with us. His energy, his spirit will stay with us forever. Thank you.
In 1986, I was a second-year resident in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Downstate and Kings County Hospital. The beginning of every month, you got a new group of interns, and I had an intern, this mammoth of a man. I looked at his ID, and it said James Mahoney. So I said, okay, Dr. Mahoney, James, and he shook out his hand, and he said, my friends call me Charlie. And I've called him Charlie ever since. I've known Charlie for so long. He had the presence of lighting up a room when he walked in there. His smile was infectious. He cared more for his patients than anyone could ever. He was also my resident when I was lucky enough to work with him in the ICU. And still to this day, he tells some of my interns until recently that I was the first person to put a Swan-Ganz catheter in him, and I taught him that procedure. During this whole pandemic, when I was in the hospital every single day, I always ran into Charlie, and it was the highlight of my trip, even on the weekends. So I will never forget Charlie Mahoney. I'll never forget the kind of doctor he was and the kind of person he was. I thank you for the opportunity to to say this. Rest in peace, my friend.
It's very hard for me to stand here and speak about Dr. James Mahoney, Charlie Mahoney, as I knew him for over 30 years. When I first met Charlie, he was the ICU fellow at Kings County on the 6th floor, and he was supervising me as a second year and a third year resident in medicine. And we used to do a lot of procedures. I remember he supervised me for over like 20 Swan-Ganz catheters at those days. Anyone passing by Clarkson Avenue gets a Swan-Ganz. And I remember his voice, I still remember his voice, telling me, never let the guide wire, never let the guide wire. I still remember that. He used to give me advices that remained with me for the rest of my career. He supervised me in so many procedures. And I remember one thing he told me actually that has contributed exceedingly significantly in my career. He tells me, with a good attitude, you go places. With a good attitude, you just go places. And that's what he exemplifies. He's such a man with a great attitude. When you see Charlie, you feel comfortable. He exudes sense of comfort. So you feel comfortable, you feel home, you feel welcome, you feel family. That's when you see Charlie. Over the years, our friendship grew to be very close, and he used to advise me on so many levels. And my last interaction with him was very late at night on the 26th of February. I was doing Kings County floors, and I had a patient with dissecting aortic aneurysm, and I sought help from Charlie because the medicine is not really a medicine case, and we were able to get the patient to land safely for surgery. And I had this opportunity. I never knew it was my last opportunity to have a good quality conversation in the encore room that was there on the 3rd floor next to the ICU at Kings County. We spoke about our memories together and what happened, and the chairmen of medicine, starting from the good old days. And it is just very fond memories. I cannot come to peace with myself that I will be walking down the halls of Downstate or Kings County without seeing Charlie. I need time to actually heal and time to actually accept that. Up until now, I don't know how I'm going to be able to deal with that. He is a man who exemplifies everything in a doctor. Highly devoted, a great teacher, as I get the feedback all the time from my function as the clerkship director in the medical school and in the residents. The people just loved Charlie. You just love him. You cannot do anything but love the man. We miss him dearly, and we wish the best for his kids and his family, and his memories will remain with us for years to come.
My acquaintance with Dr. Mahoney came at a time in my life which was crucial for the beginning of my medical profession. I had a motor vehicle accident when an oil tanker T-boned my car. And that resulted in some amnesia, which put me off like about 6 months before I could have started. I didn't know that I had amnesia. I was talking and laughing, but things weren't coming. When I wanted to say something, I didn't have the words to say it. However, I started late in my internship, and it was very difficult. During that time, there were 3 people who recognized that I had a deficit and came to my rescue. Dr. James Mahoney, Dr. Purna Atluri, and in my intern year with Dr. Sammy McFarlane. That began a relationship of dependence on these people, and more so on Dr. Mahoney, because I would see him more often at night making his notes while I'm trying to finish my notes. And so he would be there, and if I had a problem, he would sit down and discuss it with me. And going forth, it was recognized that I had this problem. And I was recommended to see a neuropsychologist who said that my problem was a memory retrieval deficit. I guess I worked on my memory, and as time went by, I began to show some progress in what came out of my cognitive capacity. Dr. Mahoney was a person I can depend on. He was a person who was selfless, and he never refused to listen. As time went by, our relationship became one of mutual respect, and I became someone who he respected. As the time go by, we became physicians working in the UPB Suite A, and we would see each other. And there again, if I had a problem, he would always make himself available to look at it and give me some solution or some advice. He became one of the persons I felt confident that I can send my patients with pulmonary problems to the point that I myself became his patient. He was my pulmonologist. Dr. Mahoney is known for his teaching. He's also one who is highly respected by the people he has shared his knowledge with. There's no doubt that he is a person that would be missed. I, for one, looked at him with respect, with admiration, and I put him at the top par excellence of whatever he did. A professor, a physician, a teacher, and to me, a friend and a colleague. I know that the kaleidoscope of SUNY Downstate will be forever changed because he's no longer in the picture. But I do know that we all have a philosophy of life. And that philosophy is dependent on whether you're religious, you're atheist, and what you were indoctrinated to believe life is. Most of us believe there's a hereafter this life. Whatever that hereafter is, we don't know. Is it another journey? I believe so. I believe that he was called at a time when there was something more or higher for him to encounter, and perhaps that's where he has gone. If my philosophy is his philosophy, and if it's the philosophy of the man upstairs, I believe that what he was called for was more important than what he did down here. And so I bid him farewell and a sojourn to another occupation, responsibility, and I know that whatever he was called to do, he will do it with his utmost.
There really are no words to describe the kindness, generosity, and support that Dr. James Charlie Mahoney showed towards all of us. My name is Joe Gorga, and I'm one of the thousands of doctors that Dr. Mahoney helped to train. As a product of SUNY Downstate's IM residency and pulmonary critical care fellowship program, like Dr. Mahoney, I've had many brilliant teachers who have aided me in becoming the doctor that I am today. But Charlie was different. He didn't just teach us medicine, but he set an example for us to follow. He taught us not only how to treat sepsis and pulmonary embolism, but how to be a professional, a friend, and a mentor to the junior doctors that we helped to shape. Dr. Mahoney had the gift that allowed him to treat the CEO of the hospital or a PCA working at the bedside with the same respect and decency. His generosity is the stuff of legend. As many remember, he fed the Kings County ICU residents and nurses every shift that he worked. He had a way of putting not only the patients at ease and gaining their trust, but he did the same for the training that he was guiding. Despite 30 years of service, his enthusiasm for medicine never diminished. He relished in a good case, especially if it came with a good story. And I'll leave you with his constant advice to me. Other than don't let go of the wire whatever you do, it was, whatever it is you like to do, do it. As I make my way through my career, I often think of him and I try to follow his advice and his example. Charlie Mahoney is a legend here in the Downstate County community, and we will keep his memory alive as I think he would have wanted, through storytelling and, more importantly, through the example for the doctors that follow us. Rest in peace, Charlie. The county loves you.
To our dear Dr. Mahoney, our brother, our friend, our storyteller, our mentor and educator, words are not enough to express our feelings at this moment. The medical ICU staff will never be the same without you. It feels like a void, almost like a dream. And when we wake up, we will see you rolling in a chair down the unit on AM rungs, calling out our names, or medication, or T-Max. In the past, you lost your best friend and mentor, the late Dr. D, and now we are devastated and heartbroken to losing you too. We guess that he wanted you to keep the work going on down here, but the Lord had a better plan for you up there. Your legacy will forever be ingrained in us all. We hope the next generation of doctors will strive to achieve that you have accomplished for our families, community, and this institution. So, Dr. Mahoney, on behalf of our ADN Mistress Watson Gray, charge nurses, nursing staff, nursing techs, nursing aides, and auxiliary MICU staff, we say farewell to you and our deepest sympathy to your loved ones. We worked hard together, solved problems together, played together. You always encourage your staff to strive for the best and to be the best. You were always taking time to listen to all of us. Gone, but certainly never forgotten. Slip on with your other angels. Our brother, God bless you all. Thank you.
I met Dr. Mahoney 7 years ago as an intern on my first elective rotation. Needless to say, I was nervous meeting him because he had this reputation of being a legend of Downstate. I don't really remember what the consult to discuss was about, but what I do remember was that about 15 seconds into my presentation, Dr. Mahoney interrupted and started off on one of his stories. Before long, we were way off topic, smiling and laughing. Whether he realized it or not, Dr. Mahoney had helped alleviate any anxiety that I had. Dr. Mahoney had this way of treating everyone as an equal partner, no matter what your status was. He made everyone feel welcome and valued, and he was also just genuinely happy and appreciative of your friendship. Even in his final days as an ICU patient himself, he would always end our conversation the same way. Thanks for coming. To his dying breath, he was gracious, kind, and humble. He trained countless residents and fellows, and we were all blessed to work with him. The training I received from him as a resident and as a fellow will be something I will carry with me throughout my career. Every time I recite the alveolar gas equation or flex the bronchoscope just enough to easily visualize the vocal cords will be a reminder that I wouldn't be where I am today without the help of Dr. Mahoney. He taught me how to be a good pulmonary and critical care physician, but more importantly, how to be a good and kind person. To this day, every time I am placing a central line, I can still hear his voice say, "Do not let go of that guide wire." And it is a gentle reminder that Dr. Mahoney is still watching over us and his ICU. Dr. Mahoney was an exemplary physician with an excellent clinical sense. He was a teacher, a doctor, a colleague, a friend to many, and an all-around class act. He worked hard, but he also knew how to make work enjoyable for himself and those around him. Dr. Mahoney will always be a role model, will always be someone I look up to, will be someone I will never forget, and will be someone I will sorely miss. Rest in peace, Dr. Mahoney.
A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, and. All right, hit it. You see, we got tachycardia. I think it's an arrhythmia. I don't know, supraventricular, or is it arrhythmia? Maybe it's just sinus. I don't know. Your Highness, what do you say?
I would try a little calcium.
Oh yeah, so why don't we just push that calcium chloride and we also make it ride, make it go up high. Oh no, we're gonna drop it low. That's the way we make it go slow.
Hi, who's on call tonight?
Hey, I'm the resident on call with you tonight.
You on my list?
No, not yet, but we...
Hi, my name is Damian Lamson, and this is my poem, Compassion. Caring about patients and optimistic for a better future, these healthcare workers may have told you before. Please, please, stay inside while altruistically saving people's lives and serving our community. I thank you for your sacrifice during this outbreak. Never have I met you, the face behind the mask, but my heart goes out to you.
conclusion, we thank the family for giving us the gift of Dr. Mahoney for all these years. I thank the event planners, Joshila Crandall, Shelley Ann Anthony, Dr. Robert Foronji, and Dr. Mafuza Rahman. I thank all the speakers. I thank our president and dean for always being there. To the faculty and house staff, thank you for the pouring sentiments that you've sent. To our brother, friend, and colleague, Dr. James Mahoney, rest in peace. We love you so much. Round Rounds is now concluded, and have a wonderful day.